To me, you're already gone, cheater.
The first thing you notice about betrayal isn't the something sharp in your back, it's the smell. Naomi came home that Tuesday night reeking of cigarettes and expensive cologne, neither of which she'd touched in our 15 years together. She kissed my cheek with lips that tasted like someone else's drink, while I sat hunched over blueprints for a custom exhaust system, my hands still black with grease from the shop. "How was your evening with Sarah?" I asked, without looking up from my work. "Fine," she said too quickly. "Just girl talk, you know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. Sarah lived in Phoenix now, had for 3 years. I'd seen the funeral announcement in the paper last month. I kept sketching, listening to her heels click across our kitchen floor. Heels she'd claimed hurt her feet and hadn't worn since our wedding. The refrigerator hummed. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday night in our normal house, except nothing felt normal anymore. "Aaron?" Her voice carried that sweet note she used when she wanted something. "I might need to borrow some cash tomorrow. Just a couple hundred." "For what?" "Sarah's having some trouble with her car." I set down my pencil and finally looked at her. Naomi stood in the doorway between our kitchen and living room, one hand on her hip, the other fidgeting with her wedding ring. She'd done her makeup again after work, fresh lipstick, new mascara, the kind of touching up you do for someone special. "I thought you said Sarah was doing better these days." "She is, but you know how expensive car repairs can be." I knew. I'd been fixing cars and fabricating custom parts for 21 years, ever since I dropped out of community college to help my dad keep his sheet metal shop afloat. Started as an apprentice, became a partner, then took over completely when the old man's arthritis got too bad for the heavy work. Built a decent life with my hands and my back, nothing fancy but honest. "I can take a look at her car if she wants," I offered. "Might save her some money." Naomi's smile flickered like a candle in wind. "That's sweet, but she's already committed to someone else." That's when I knew for certain my wife was lying. Sarah had been driving the same Honda Civic for 8 years, and I'd worked on it dozens of times. If anyone was going to fix her car, it would be me. But Sarah wasn't here to have car trouble. Sarah was dead, and Naomi was using her memory to cover up whatever the hell she was really doing with her evenings. I went back to my blueprints. "Sure thing. Cash is in the safe. Thanks, baby." She kissed the top of my head, and that cologne smell hit me again. Expensive stuff. The kind that comes in small bottles with foreign names. After she went upstairs, I sat in my workshop until past midnight, not really working on anything, just thinking. 15 years of marriage teaches you things. Teaches you the difference between a wife getting ready for bed and a wife getting ready for someone else. Teaches you that loyalty is like good steel. It either holds under pressure or it doesn't. There's no in between. Naomi's loyalty, I was starting to suspect, had developed some serious cracks. The next morning, I found the first pawn slip. It was wedged between the pages of a magazine Naomi had left on her nightstand, a receipt from Eddie's Pawn and Tool downtown. My grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones Naomi claimed she'd lost at her company Christmas party last year. Pawned 3 days ago for $215. My hands shook as I read the faded carbon copy. Those earrings had been in my family for 60 years. My grandfather had bought them for my grandmother with his first real paycheck after the war. When my mother passed, she left them specifically for my future wife. Naomi had worn them on our wedding day, tears in her eyes as she promised to treasure them forever. $215. I slipped the receipt into my wallet and headed to work, trying to process what it meant. People pawn things for fast cash when they're desperate or when they're hiding something. Naomi wasn't desperate. I handled our finances, and while we weren't rich, we were comfortable. Her teacher's salary plus my shop income kept us stable, even let us save a little each month, so she was hiding something. At the shop, I tried to focus on the custom exhaust manifold I was building for a local racing enthusiast, but my mind kept drifting. Zip arrived around 9, coffee in one hand, and a gas station breakfast burrito in the other. Milo Carver, everyone called him Zip because he could strip and rebuild an engine faster than anyone I'd ever seen, had been working for me for 3 years. Started as an apprentice, just like I had, and learned the trade with the same hungry intensity I remembered from my early days. "Morning, boss," he said, tying his apron around his waist. "That manifold coming along?" "Yeah, should have it finished by Friday." I watched him set up his workstation with the methodical precision I'd taught him. Zip, you ever notice anything strange about people when they're lying to you? He paused, a wrench halfway to his toolbox. That's a weird question for a Wednesday morning. Just curious, I guess. He shrugged. My ex used to get real specific about things when she was lying. Like, instead of saying she went to the store, she'd say she went to the Kroger on 5th Street and bought milk and bread and had to wait in line behind an old lady with coupons. Too many details, you know. I thought about Naomi's story. Sarah and her car trouble. Sarah, who was dead. What else? She'd touch her face a lot. And she'd agree with me too quick, like she didn't want to argue about anything because arguments meant questions. Zip opened his toolbox and started organizing his tools. Why? Naomi giving you trouble? No, I lied. Just something I saw on TV. But the rest of the day, I kept thinking about details. About cologne and heels and dead friends who needed car repairs, about pawn slips hidden in magazines and pearls that were supposed to be treasured forever. That evening, I came home to find Naomi in the kitchen, humming while she cooked dinner. She'd made my favorite, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. The table was set with our good dishes, the ones we usually reserved for holidays or when her parents visited. What's the occasion? I asked, washing grease from my hands at the kitchen sink. No occasion. Just wanted to do something nice for my husband. There it was again, too many details. Not just, I wanted to cook for you, but a whole explanation about doing something nice for her husband, like she was convincing herself as much as me. Smells great, I said, and it did. Naomi was a good cook when she put effort into it. How was your day? Oh, you know, same old stuff. Graded papers, dealt with parents, tried to teach 7th graders about the Revolutionary War. She opened the oven to check the meatloaf. Mrs. Patterson's son is failing again. I might have to call home. Normal details. Believable details. The kind of thing she'd tell me any other day. But now I was listening for lies, and everything sounded rehearsed. And after work? Stopped by the grocery store, had to get ingredients for this. She gestured at the dinner. Oh, and I saw Janet from next door. Her cat got out again. I nodded and sat down at the table. Janet from next door had moved to Florida 6 months ago. The house was empty, had a for sale sign in the front yard. Did they catch the cat? Eventually. Naomi brought the meatloaf to the table, not meeting my eyes. You know how cats are. We ate in relative silence, making small talk about work and weather and the neighbor's lawn that needed cutting. Normal married couple conversation. Except my wife was lying about everything, and I was starting to understand just how much trouble we were really in. After dinner, while Naomi watched television, I went back to my workshop and thought about my options. I could confront her directly, but that would just put her on guard. I could hire a private investigator, but that felt like admitting defeat. Or I could figure out what she was up to myself. I chose option 3. The next morning, I called in sick to work, first time in 4 years, and followed my wife. Naomi left our house at 7:30 sharp, same as always. But instead of turning toward Roosevelt Elementary where she taught, she drove downtown to a part of the city I rarely visited anymore. Old industrial district, full of warehouses and abandoned factories and businesses that operated on the margins of legitimate commerce. I stayed 3 cars back, a trick I'd learned from detective shows, and watched her park outside a converted textile mill that had been turned into loft apartments. Expensive ones from the look of the cars in the lot. BMWs and Audis and one cherry red Corvette that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Naomi walked to the main entrance like she'd done it 100 times before. She had a key. I parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, a man emerged from the building. Tall, probably my age, wearing a suit that fit too well to be off the rack. Dark hair slicked back, designer sunglasses, gold watch that caught the morning light. He walked to the Corvette, and I got a good look at his face as he removed his sunglasses to clean them. Felix Hart. I knew the name from newspaper stories about illegal gambling raids and suspected money laundering operations. The kind of man who owned restaurants and import businesses and other enterprises that generated cash without much paperwork. The kind of man who drove expensive cars and wore expensive cologne. The kind of man my wife was apparently involved with. Felix drove away, and I settled in to wait for Naomi. She emerged 2 hours later, hair mussed, lipstick gone, looking satisfied in a way I hadn't seen in months. She drove straight to school, arriving just in time for her first class. I sat in my truck outside that converted mill for another hour, trying to process what I'd seen. My wife was having an affair. Not just an emotional thing or a workplace flirtation, but a full-blown, key-to-his-apartment, 2 hours in the morning affair with a man who made his living in the shadows. The smart thing would have been to drive home, pack my stuff, and call a divorce lawyer. Cut my losses, split our assets, start over at 39 with whatever dignity I had left. But as I sat there staring at that building, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. Something that had nothing to do with smart decisions or dignity. I felt betrayed, not just by the affair, but by the lies. By the pearls in the pawn shop and the stories about dead friends and the elaborate deception she'd been running for God knew how long. Naomi hadn't just cheated on me, she'd made me complicit in my own humiliation by believing her stories and giving her money to fund whatever this was. That afternoon, I drove to Eddie's pawn and tool. Help you? Eddie was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook when he counted money. His shop smelled like tool oil and disappointment. Looking for information about something that was pawned here recently, I showed him the receipt. These earrings. Eddie squinted at the paper, then at me. You the husband? Yeah. Figured you might show up eventually. Lady said they were hers, but I could tell they meant something to somebody else. Good pieces, real pearls, decent setting. Shame to see them go. She say why she was pawning them? Never asked. None of my business why people need money fast. Eddie shrugged. But she knew the drill, if you know what I mean. Wasn't her first time? She's been here before. Few times over the past couple months. Small stuff mostly. Jewelry, a watch, some electronics. Always paid the interest, always bought back the important pieces. Eddie leaned across the counter. But these earrings? She took the cash and walked. No talk about buying them back. I left Eddie's with the earrings, cost me $300 to get them out of Hawk, and a better understanding of how deep Naomi's secret life ran. She'd been pawning our possessions for months, funding whatever relationship she had with Felix Hart, using our marriage as collateral for her other life. That evening, I made dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meat sauce, but I set the table with our good dishes and lit a candle in the center. When Naomi came home, she looked surprised. What's all this? Felt like doing something nice for my wife, I said, echoing her words from the night before. She smiled, but I caught something uncertain in her eyes. That's sweet. How was your day? Zip said you called in sick. Just needed some time to think. I served the spaghetti, keeping my voice casual. Actually, went for a drive downtown. Saw some interesting places. Oh? Like where? That old textile mill they converted to apartments. Looks expensive. Naomi's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I wouldn't know. I don't really go downtown much. Right. I took a bite of spaghetti. Too bad about Janet's cat getting out again. What? You mentioned it yesterday. Janet from next door, her cat got out. Naomi set down her fork. Did I say that? I meant someone else. Someone from work. Janet from work? Yes, Janet Patterson, the parent I mentioned with the failing son. She has a cat. I nodded like that made perfect sense. Must be going around. Lot of cats getting loose lately. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. Naomi excused herself early, claiming she had papers to grade, and disappeared upstairs. I cleaned the dishes and went to my workshop, where I sat with my grandmother's pearl earrings in my palm and tried to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. The kind who got divorced quietly and moved on with his life, or the kind who fought back. By midnight, I'd made my choice. I started documenting everything. Times, places, names, lies. I bought a small notebook and kept it in my truck, writing down every detail of Naomi's deception. The stories that didn't add up, the money that went missing, the nights she came home smelling like someone else's life. More importantly, I started learning about Felix Hart. 3 nights a week, I'd tell Naomi I was working late at the shop, then drive downtown to watch Felix's building. I learned his patterns, his associates, his business. Felix ran high-stakes poker games in the basement of an abandoned steel foundry about 10 miles outside the city. The games drew wealthy players from Detroit and Chicago, men who flew in on private jets and lost more money in a single night than most people made in a year. It was illegal as hell, but profitable. Felix took a cut of every pot, provided security, and kept the games running smoothly. From what I could observe, he was pulling in serious money, the kind that let him afford expensive apartments and sports cars and whatever else he needed to impress married women looking for excitement. What I couldn't figure out was Naomi's role in all of it. She wasn't the type for high-stakes gambling. She got nervous betting $5 on office football pools. But she was involved somehow, and whatever she was doing required regular infusions of cash. The answer came on a Thursday night when I followed her to a different location entirely. Instead of Felix's apartment, Naomi drove to a shabby motel on the outskirts of town. She parked next to a rusted sedan and walked to room 237, where she was met by a woman I recognized from our occasional social gatherings. Inez Sloan, a friend from Naomi's teaching days who'd left education to work in real estate, 50s, divorced twice, always wore too much jewelry and talked too loud at parties. I positioned myself where I could see the motel room window and waited. 20 minutes later, both women emerged. Inez handed Naomi a manila envelope, thick with what looked like cash. Naomi gave Inez something in return, a smaller envelope, white, sealed. They talked for a few minutes, then drove away in different directions. I followed Inez. She drove straight to Felix's building, parked in her usual spot, and went inside. She emerged an hour later with a black briefcase, which she locked in her trunk before driving to an all-night diner near the interstate. At the diner, Inez met with two men I didn't recognize. The exchange was quick, briefcase for a different briefcase, and then everyone went their separate ways. It took me 3 more nights of following the same pattern to understand what I was seeing. Inez was a courier, moving money between Felix's poker games and his various business interests. But she was also something else, a loan shark, providing cash to people who needed it fast and couldn't get it through legitimate channels. And Naomi was one of her clients. The white envelopes contained IOUs, gambling debts, promises to pay. The manila envelopes contained cash advances, loans at carnivory interest rates that would keep borrowers trapped in an endless cycle of debt. Naomi wasn't just having an affair with Felix. She was financing it with borrowed money, using our marriage and our assets as collateral for increasingly dangerous loans. But there was still something I was missing. Something that explained why Naomi would risk everything for this particular man, why she'd jeopardize our marriage and our financial stability for someone who operated on the wrong side of the law. The answer came from an unexpected source. Zip found me in my workshop one evening, tinkering with a carburetor that didn't really need fixing. I'd been distracted lately, making mistakes, leaving projects half-finished. He'd noticed, and, being Zip, he'd decided to address it directly. "Boss, you mind if I ask you something personal?" I looked up from the carburetor. "Shoot. You and Naomi having problems? What makes you ask that? You've been different lately. Distant. And yesterday I saw her with some guy at that coffee shop downtown. They looked close." My hands stilled on the carburetor. "What guy?" "Older, well-dressed, fancy car." "They were holding hands. Looked like they were arguing about something." Zip shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't want to get in your business, but you're a good boss and a decent guy. If something's going on, maybe you should know about it." "This guy, what did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, expensive suit. Drove a red Corvette." Zip paused. "Actually, I think I've seen him before. At Riley's bar, playing pool with some guys who looked like trouble. Someone called him Felix." So it wasn't just about Zex or excitement or whatever middle-aged dissatisfaction had led my wife into another man's bed. Felix was recruiting her for something, using their relationship to draw her deeper into his world. The question was whether Naomi understood what she was getting into, or if she was just another mark in a longer con. Either way, I was done being a spectator in my own life. The next morning, I called Lorna Vicks. Lorna and I had known each other since elementary school. We'd grown up on the same block, dated briefly in high school before realizing we were better as friends, and kept in touch over the years, despite taking very different paths. While I'd learned to work with my hands, Lorna had put herself through college and police academy, eventually making detective with the Metro Police Department. She was also one of the few people I trusted completely. "Aaron Briggs," she said when she answered her phone. "Haven't heard from you in months. How's the metalworking business?" "Good. Listen, Lorna, I need to ask you about someone, unofficially." "Uh-oh, this sounds like trouble." "Felix Hart." "You know the name?" There was a long pause. "Yeah, I know it. Why are you asking about Felix Hart?" "He's involved with my wife." Another pause, longer this time. "Aaron, that's not good news." Felix Hart is bad news in general, but if he's messing around with civilian women, that's worse. Can you meet me for coffee? This isn't a phone conversation. We met at a diner halfway between my shop and the police station. Lorna looked older than I remembered, her blonde hair showing gray at the roots, lines around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights dealing with humanity's worst impulses. But she still had the direct gaze and no-nonsense manner that had made her a good cop and a better friend. Felix Hart runs illegal gambling operations, she said without preamble. High-stakes poker games, sports betting, probably some money laundering on the side. We've been trying to build a case against him for 2 years, but he's smart. Uses cutouts, changes locations, keeps everything compartmentalized. What about loan sharking? That too. He's got a network of people who provide financing for gamblers who can't cover their losses. Inez Sloan is one of his main operators. Lorna stirred sugar into her coffee. How deep is Naomi into this? I told her everything I'd observed over the past few weeks. The lies, the pawned jewelry, the meetings with Inez, the cash exchanges at the motel. Lorna listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned. Aaron, your wife is in serious trouble. The people Felix does business with don't accept bankruptcy or divorce as excuses for unpaid debts. If she owes money and can't pay, they'll come after whatever asset she has access to, including mine, including yours. Your house, your business, anything with both your names on it? Lorna leaned forward. But there's something else you need to know. We think Felix has been recruiting civilian women to help with his operations, using them as fronts for real estate transactions, bank accounts, legitimate businesses that can hide illegal income. You think that's what Naomi is doing? I think it's a possibility. And if it is, she could be facing federal charges for money laundering and racketeering, not just infidelity and bad judgment. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth. What are my options? Legally. Get a good divorce attorney and try to protect your assets before this thing explodes. Practically. Lorna shrugged. Depends on what kind of man you are. Some guys would walk away. Others would fight back. What would you do? I'd be careful. Felix Hart has hurt people who got in his way, and I'd remember that sometimes the best revenge is just letting bad people destroy themselves. That evening, I sat in my workshop and thought about what Lorna had told me. Naomi wasn't just cheating. She was potentially committing federal crimes with a man who had a history of violence. Our marriage was over. That much was clear. But our financial entanglement meant I couldn't just walk away without risking everything I'd worked for. Felix had dragged my wife into his world, and now he was threatening mine. The smart thing would have been to hire a lawyer and file for divorce, try to salvage what I could from the wreckage of our marriage. But sitting there, surrounded by the tools of my trade, thinking about pearl earrings and pawn shops and dead friends who needed car repairs, I found myself considering other options. Less smart options, more satisfying ones. I opened my notebook and started making a different kind of list. Not observations and evidence, but possibilities. Ways a man with my skills and knowledge might level the playing field against someone like Felix Hart. I was still writing when Naomi came home. You're up late, she said, appearing in the doorway of my workshop. Couldn't sleep. How was your evening? Quiet. Graded papers. Watched some TV. She leaned against the doorframe, and I caught that familiar scent of expensive cologne. What are you working on? Just planning some modifications to the shop. Thinking about expanding? That sounds expensive. Good investment, though. Build the business, secure our future. I looked up at her. Our future is important to me, Naomi. I hope it's important to you, too. Something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or recognition that she was standing in the workshop of a husband she was systematically betraying. Of course it is, she said. I love you, Aaron. You know that, right? I know what you tell me. She stood there for another moment, perhaps sensing the shift in my tone, but not quite understanding it. Then she said goodnight and went upstairs, leaving me alone with my tools and my plans and my growing understanding that sometimes love isn't enough to save a marriage, but it might be enough to destroy the people who threaten it. I closed my notebook and began the work of becoming someone my wife wouldn't recognize. The first step was making Felix Hart think he was winning. I started leaving money around the house, 20s and 50s, in obvious places where Naomi would find them. My wallet forgotten on the kitchen counter with more cash than usual. An envelope of shop receipts with a few $100s mixed in, left on my desk, where she'd see it while dusting. The money disappeared, as I knew it would. But more importantly, I started talking about my fictional expansion plans. How well the shop was doing, how I was considering taking out a business loan to buy better equipment, maybe hire another full-time employee. I mentioned specific dollar amounts, the kind of money that would interest a man like Felix Hart if he was recruiting my wife for something bigger than just an affair. At the same time, I began my real preparation. I moved our actual savings to a new account at a different bank, using only my name and a post office box Felix's people couldn't easily trace. I transferred ownership of my most valuable tools and equipment to Zip, with paperwork that would make them difficult to seize if someone came after my assets. I even started wearing cheaper clothes and driving my older truck, creating the impression of a man whose finances were tighter than they appeared. But my most important preparation was psychological. I studied Felix Hart the way I'd once studied metallurgy and engine design. I learned his patterns, his weaknesses, his pressure points, the illegal poker games that were his primary income source, the loan sharking operation that depended on fear and intimidation, the expensive lifestyle that required constant cash flow to maintain. Most importantly, I learned about his enemies. Felix's success had made him rivals among other criminal organizations in the region. I spent evenings in bars where these men gathered, listening to conversations and identifying opportunities. A poker game operator from Toledo who'd lost territory to Felix's expansion, a loan shark from Detroit who resented Felix's rates undercutting his business. Small-time players who'd grown large enough to challenge Felix's dominance but lacked the intelligence network to strike effectively. All of them would be interested in information about Felix's operations. Locations, schedules, financial vulnerabilities, the kind of intelligence a sheet metal worker married to one of Felix's associates might accidentally overhear. The trick was making sure the information reached them indirectly, in ways that couldn't be traced back to me. I started with the Toledo poker operator, a man named Carl Brennan, who ran games out of a converted warehouse near the docks. I'd met him through a customer who played in both Felix's and Carl's games, and I'd made sure to seem like just another working guy who occasionally enjoyed a friendly poker night. "That Hart guy's been cutting into everyone's business," Carl mentioned one evening as I nursed a beer and lost modestly at 5-card stud. "Hart?" I asked, like I'd never heard the name. "Felix Hart. Runs games out of the old foundry. Thinks he's some kind of criminal mastermind. Been recruiting civilians to help launder his money using their legitimate businesses as fronts." Sounds complicated. It is, and risky. One of these civilian partners gets cold feet or starts talking to cops, his whole operation comes down. Carl studied his cards, but I hear he's been careless lately. Getting personally involved with some of his recruits, I made appropriate sounds of interest and let the conversation move on to other topics. But 2 days later, I arranged for Carl to receive an anonymous tip about Felix's upcoming game at the Foundry: location, date, estimated number of players, probable cash amounts. The tip came from a burner phone purchased with cash, the kind used by people who didn't want their communications traced, and the information was accurate enough to prove I had inside knowledge of Felix's operations. Carl's people hit the game 3 nights later. Not to rob it, that would have been too obvious and too dangerous. Instead, they called in an anonymous tip to the police about illegal gambling at the Foundry location. The raid netted Felix's security people on weapons charges and disrupted the game, costing Felix both money and reputation among his high-stakes clientele. More importantly, it put Felix on edge. Paranoid about security, suspicious of his associates, wondering who had given up his location to rivals. The second step was eliminating Inez Sloan. Not physically. I wasn't that kind of person, despite what my wife's betrayal was doing to my moral framework. But Inez was the key to Felix's loan sharking operation, and she had a weakness I could exploit: immigration status. Inez Sloan wasn't actually Inez Sloan. Through careful investigation and some help from Lorna's contacts, I'd learned she was actually Inez Carrasco, an undocumented immigrant who'd been using false papers for 15 years. She'd built a successful life under her assumed identity, but it was built on a foundation that would crumble if the wrong people started asking questions. I didn't turn her into immigration authorities. That would have been cruel, and it wouldn't have served my purposes anyway. Instead, I made sure Felix's rivals in Detroit learned about Inez's real identity and her role in his money laundering operation. The Detroit crew had connections with federal law enforcement, not as informants, but as people who knew how to provide anonymous tips that would trigger investigations. A few phone calls from them, and Inez would find herself under scrutiny from agencies that could make her life very complicated very quickly. Faced with that pressure, most people in Inez's position would make one of two choices: run or negotiate. Either way, Felix would lose his primary courier and financial facilitator at a time when his operation was already under stress from the foundry raid. I gave the Detroit crew Inez's real name, her address, and details about her regular meetings with Felix's people. Then, I sat back to watch what developed. It didn't take long. Within a week, Inez stopped showing up at the motel for her meetings with Naomi. When Naomi called her, the phone went straight to voicemail. Felix's people started asking questions about missing money and disrupted schedules, and my wife began to panic. Inez isn't answering her phone, Naomi mentioned one evening over dinner, trying to sound casual. Inez from your teaching days? I asked, cutting into my steak like we were discussing the weather. Yeah. She was helping me with some financial planning, investment stuff, but now I can't reach her. Maybe she went out of town. Didn't you say she liked to travel? I guess. But Naomi's voice carried a note of desperation I hadn't heard before. It's just that I was depending on her advice for some decisions I need to make. Financial decisions, like how to pay back loans to dangerous people when your courier had vanished and your source of easy money had dried up. I'm sure she'll turn up, I said, and went back to my dinner. But privately, I knew Inez Sloan, or Inez Carrasco, or whatever name she was using next, had made the smart choice and disappeared before federal investigators could connect her to Felix's money laundering operation. She was probably in Mexico by now, or Canada, or anywhere that offered better prospects than explaining her immigration status to federal agents, which left Naomi holding debts she couldn't pay to a man whose criminal empire was starting to crack under pressure. It was time for phase 3 of my plan. The trick to destroying someone like Felix Hart isn't attacking him directly. It's attacking the system that supports him. Take away his money, his security, his reputation, and even the most dangerous criminal becomes just another desperate man making bad decisions. By the time Inez disappeared, Felix was already feeling pressure from multiple directions. The Foundry raid had cost him his primary game location and spooked several high-value players. Rival organizations were moving into his territory, offering better odds and more secure games to his former clientele. And now his financial network was compromised, with Inez gone and other associates wondering if they were next. But Felix still had one major asset: the civilian partners he'd recruited to launder money through legitimate businesses, including my wife. That's where I decided to apply the final pressure. I started by making Felix's life complicated in small but persistent ways: anonymous tips to health inspectors about restaurants he owned, reports to the IRS about suspicious cash transactions at his legitimate businesses, complaints to the Better Business Bureau about his import company's practices. None of these things were enough to shut him down, but together they created a pattern of scrutiny that made his operations more difficult and expensive to maintain. He had to hire lawyers, accountants, and fixers to deal with the constant investigations. Money that should have been profit was diverted to damage control. More importantly, the scrutiny made his civilian partners nervous. People like Naomi had signed up for excitement and easy money, not federal investigations and audit trails that could lead back to their legitimate lives. I knew this because I'd started listening to my wife's phone calls. Installing the recording device had been simple enough: a small digital recorder connected to our landline, the kind used by businesses to monitor customer service calls. Completely legal as long as I was a party to the conversations or they took place in my house. Most of Naomi's calls with Felix happened on her cell phone, but she still used our home phone occasionally, especially when she was stressed and thought she needed the security of a landline. I don't like what's happening, I heard her tell someone, probably Felix, on a Tuesday evening. Inez is gone. Your games are getting raided, and now you're asking me to sign papers for things I don't understand. The male voice on the other end was calm, reassuring. It's temporary, baby. Just some business restructuring. Once things settle down, everything goes back to normal. But what if it doesn't settle down? What if the police start looking at me? They won't. You're a teacher, married to a working guy. Nobody's going to suspect you of anything. There was a long pause. Then Naomi said, I want out, Felix. This has gone too far. You can't get out. Not yet. You owe money, remember? Your husband's business is about to expand, right? Once that loan comes through, you can pay everything back, and we can talk about your future. My fictional business loan. Felix was counting on money that didn't exist to keep my wife trapped in his operation. Aaron's been acting strange lately, Naomi said. Like he knows something. Does he? I don't think so. But he's not stupid. If he starts asking the right questions, then make sure he doesn't have reason to ask questions. Be a good wife. Keep him happy. And remember what happens to people who create problems for me. The call ended and I sat in my workshop staring at the recorder. Felix was threatening my wife, using her debts and her fear to keep her compliant. And he was planning to steal money from a business loan I was never going to take out. That night, I made a decision that would have horrified the man I'd been 6 months earlier. I was going to destroy Felix's heart completely. Not just drive him out of business or get him arrested. I was going to take everything he had and leave him with nothing. And I was going to use my wife to do it. The next morning, I called 3 different banks about business expansion loans. Not to actually borrow money, but to get the paperwork started. Applications, credit checks, preliminary approval letters, the kind of documentation that would convince Felix I was serious about expanding my shop. Then I had lunch with Zip and told him about my fictional plans in detail. Thinking about taking out a $200,000 loan, I said, cutting into my sandwich. Upgrade the equipment, hire 2 more full-time guys, maybe buy the building next door and expand our space. Zip looked impressed. That's a big step, boss. Business has been good, but that's a lot of debt to take on. Sometimes you have to risk big to win big, I said, repeating a phrase I'd heard Felix use during one of his phone calls. Bank says I should have preliminary approval by next week. I made sure to mention specific dollar amounts, timelines, and details about the collateral I'd be putting up. Information that would sound impressive to someone looking for opportunities to steal money from legitimate businesses. And I made sure Naomi overheard these conversations. $200,000? She said that evening, sitting down at our kitchen table where I was reviewing loan paperwork. That seems like a lot. It is a lot, but the business is ready for it and the bank agrees. Sometimes you have to make big moves to secure your future. I looked up at her. Our future. What if something goes wrong? What if the expansion doesn't work out? Then we lose everything. The shop, the house, our savings. Everything we've built together over 15 years. I went back to the paperwork, but I'm confident it's the right move. The loan officer says I should have final approval within 2 weeks. Naomi nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. $200,000. Enough to pay off whatever she owed Felix and still have money left over. Enough to make running away with her lover look financially feasible. Enough to make her do something stupid. Over the next few days, I watched my wife's behavior change. She became more affectionate, more attentive, asking detailed questions about the loan process and my expansion plans. She cooked my favorite meals and wore clothes I hadn't seen in months. She was trying to keep me happy and distracted while she figured out how to steal my money, but she was also getting sloppy. Phone calls made from our home phone instead of her cell. Papers left where I could see them. Credit card receipts from stores and restaurants I didn't recognize. Most importantly, she started meeting with Felix more frequently, and those meetings were taking place at locations I could observe. On a Thursday night, I followed them to a dive bar on the outskirts of town. Through the window, I watched them argue over drinks. Felix gestured angrily. Naomi shook her head, and both of them looked like people under pressure. They were planning something, but they disagreed about the details. I took pictures through the window with a telephoto lens. Not great quality, but clear enough to show my wife in an intimate conversation with a known criminal. Evidence that would be useful later when lawyers got involved. On Friday night, they met at a different location, a parking garage downtown where they sat in Felix's Corvette for an hour, talking and occasionally looking at documents. Again, I took pictures. Again, they looked like conspirators under pressure. By Saturday, I was ready for the final phase of my plan. I called the bank and told them I'd changed my mind about the expansion loan. Too risky, I explained. Bad timing with the economy. The loan officer was disappointed but understanding. Business owners change their minds about big investments all the time. Then I waited to see what Naomi and Felix would do when they discovered their target had disappeared. The phone call came at 11:30 on a Sunday night. I was in my workshop pretending to work on a carburetor while actually waiting for my wife to make her move. When our landline rang, I let it go to the answering machine but turned up the volume so I could hear both sides of the conversation. "Aaron? Naomi's voice calling from her cell phone. She sounded panicked. Aaron, are you there? I need you to pick up. I didn't pick up. Listen, I'm at Sarah's house. You remember Sarah, my friend from school. She's having a crisis, and I need to stay here tonight to help her. I'll be home tomorrow, but don't wait up. I love you. Sarah, who had been dead for months. Naomi was using a dead woman as an alibi while she did whatever Felix had convinced her to do. I gave her 20 minutes, then drove to our bank. The Metropolitan Trust building was downtown, a 12-story glass tower that housed the main branch where we'd done our banking for 8 years. More importantly, it housed the safe deposit box where I kept important documents, insurance papers, titles, birth certificates, and other items that would be valuable to someone planning to steal my identity or forge loan documents. I parked across the street and waited. At 12:45, Felix's red Corvette pulled up in front of the bank. Naomi got out, looked around nervously, then walked to the bank's main entrance. She had keys to the bank, which was impossible unless Felix had inside help, or unless they weren't planning to break in at all. I watched through binoculars as Naomi used what looked like a security card to enter the bank. No alarms went off. No police responded. She was inside the building legally, which meant Felix had somehow gotten her legitimate access. 10 minutes later, she emerged with a manila envelope and got back into Felix's car. They drove away quickly, heading toward the interstate. I followed from a distance, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just witnessed. Naomi had bank access outside normal hours, which meant Felix had either bribed a bank employee or found some other way to compromise their security. And she'd taken something from inside, documents or information that related to our accounts. But I'd moved our money weeks ago. Whatever they'd taken would lead them to empty accounts and closed-loop paperwork that wouldn't help them steal anything, unless they were planning something else entirely. Felix and Naomi drove to his apartment building, where they spent an hour inside before emerging with 2 large suitcases and a briefcase. They loaded everything into the Corvette and drove toward the outskirts of town, eventually stopping at a 24-hour truck stop near the highway. I parked where I could observe them through the diner's windows. They sat in a back booth, spreading papers across the table, talking intensely. Felix made several phone calls. Naomi looked increasingly agitated. After 2 hours, they were joined by a third person, a thin man in an expensive suit who carried his own briefcase. The 3 of them talked for another hour, examining documents and occasionally pointing at specific pages. Finally, the thin man left. Felix and Naomi gathered their papers and returned to the Corvette, but instead of driving back to town, they headed toward the interstate. They were running. I followed them for 50 miles before they stopped at an all-night gas station. While Felix filled the tank, Naomi went inside and made a phone call from the payphone. Even from across the parking lot, I could see she was crying. I parked behind the station and circled around on foot until I was close enough to hear her side of the conversation. It didn't work, she was saying. The account was empty. Everything was empty. He moved the money somewhere else. A pause while she listened to whoever was on the other end. I don't know when. Could have been weeks ago. The loan documents were fake, too. He never applied for any expansion loan. Another pause. Longer this time. Felix says we have to go through with it anyway. Says the people in Detroit won't accept failure as an excuse. Her voice broke. I'm scared. This isn't what I signed up for. She hung up and walked back to the Corvette, where Felix was waiting with obvious impatience. They drove away, continuing toward the state line. I didn't follow them any further. I'd learned what I needed to know. Naomi and Felix had tried to steal money that wasn't there, using bank access that Felix had obtained through criminal means. Now they were running from consequences, both legal and personal. The people Felix owed money to wouldn't care that their scheme had failed. They'd expect payment regardless, which meant Felix and Naomi were about to become fugitives. I drove home and called Lorna Vicks. Aaron, it's 4 a.m. This better be important. Felix Hart and my wife just attempted bank fraud. They're currently fleeing the state in a red Corvette license plate. I read off the number I'd memorized. Jesus. Are you sure? I watched them break into Metropolitan Trust and steal documents from our safe deposit box. Then they met with someone who looked like a document forger and tried to use fake loan papers to access accounts I'd already emptied. Where are they now? Last I saw, heading south on Interstate 75, probably trying to reach Detroit or Chicago. Before their contacts realized the money isn't coming, there was a long pause. Aaron, I have to ask, did you set this up? Did you deliberately create a situation where your wife would attempt bank fraud? I thought about my answer carefully. I protected my assets from people who were planning to steal them. If they chose to commit crimes in the process, that was their decision. That's not exactly what I asked. It's the only answer I'm giving. Lorna sighed. Okay, I'll make some calls, see if we can pick them up before they cross state lines. But Aaron, when this is over, we need to have a serious conversation about vigilante justice and the difference between protecting yourself and setting traps for other people. When this is over, I said, I think I'll be having a lot of serious conversations. I hung up and sat in my kitchen, waiting for dawn and whatever came next. My wife was gone, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. Our marriage was over, had been over for months, probably longer. But Felix Hart had made the mistake of threatening what I'd built with my own hands, and now he was going to pay for that mistake. The only question was whether Naomi would go down with him or if she'd find a way to save herself before it was too late. I hoped, for both our sakes, that she'd choose wisely, but I wasn't counting on it. They caught Felix and Naomi 6 hours later at a truck stop outside Toledo. Lorna called me at 10 in the morning with the details. State police pulled them over for a broken taillight. Found forged bank documents, stolen credit cards, and about $30,000 in cash that they can't explain the source of. What happens now? Felix is looking at federal charges for bank fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Could be 15 to 20 years if they can prove half of what they suspect. Naomi, Lorna paused. That depends on how cooperative she decides to be. Meaning if she helps prosecutors build a case against Felix and his organization, she might get a plea deal, probation, community service, maybe a year in minimum security. But if she stays loyal to him, she's looking at 5 to 10 years as an accessory to everything he's done. I thought about the woman I'd married 15 years ago. The teacher who'd cried when she put my grandmother's earrings in her ears on our wedding day. The person who'd promised to love and honor me until death did us part. What would you do, I asked, if I were her? I'd tell the truth and hope the prosecutor believes I was manipulated rather than complicit. Lorna's voice was careful, but that would require admitting I'd been wrong about a lot of things. The arraignment was set for the following Monday. I didn't attend, but Zip did, curious about the outcome. He came back to the shop with news. She took the deal, he said, hanging up his jacket, testified against the boyfriend, told them about his whole operation. Money laundering, loan sharking, the illegal gambling, everything. How did she look? Like someone who'd aged about 10 years in a week. Her lawyer said she was cooperating fully, accepting responsibility for her part in everything. Zip started organizing his tools. Felix didn't take it as well. Started screaming about betrayal and revenge before they dragged him out of the courtroom. Revenge against who? You, mostly. Kept saying you'd set them up, that none of this would have happened if you hadn't interfered with his business. I thought about that while I worked on a custom exhaust system for a local racing enthusiast. Felix Hart wasn't wrong. I had interfered with his business, deliberately, systematically, and with full knowledge of the likely consequences. But he'd made the mistake of involving my wife in criminal activities and threatening the life I'd built. That evening, I found a divorce petition in my mailbox. Naomi was filing for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, requesting division of assets and spousal support. Her lawyer had prepared the papers while she was in jail, apparently planning for the possibility that her cooperation with prosecutors wouldn't be enough to save her marriage. She was right about that. I called my own lawyer the next morning and began the process of protecting what remained of my assets from Naomi's creditors and legal obligations. The house would have to be sold, too many joint debts and obligations to untangle easily. But the shop was mine, as was most of our remaining savings, now that I'd documented Naomi's gambling debts and fraudulent activities. 2 weeks later, Naomi was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison, plus 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. Felix got 12 years in federal prison and forfeiture of all assets connected to his criminal enterprises, but the story didn't end there. On a Thursday evening, 3 months after the sentencing, I was closing up the shop when Zip burst through the front door. "Boss, we got a problem. Big problem." I looked up from the invoice I was completing. "What kind of problem?" "The kind with tools. Two guys in a black sedan. Been sitting across the street for 20 minutes. One of them has a tattoo on his neck that looks like the Detroit crew symbols we've seen in the papers. Felix's former associates. The people he'd owed money to when his operation collapsed. The people who might hold me responsible for disrupting their business relationship." "Back door?" I asked. "Already checked. Another car, probably two more guys." I thought about our options. The shop had good security. Steel doors, reinforced windows. Alarm system connected directly to the police station. But if these people were serious about settling accounts, security measures would only slow them down. "Call Lorna," I said. "Tell her we have visitors who might be connected to the Felix Hart case." While Zip made the call, I gathered the things I'd need if we had to leave quickly. Cash from the safe, important documents, the backup drives containing all my business records, everything I'd learned about protecting assets during a crisis. But before we could implement any escape plan, the situation changed. The black sedan pulled away from the curb and drove slowly past the shop. The driver, a heavy-set man with dark hair, stared directly at me through the window. He didn't make any threatening gestures, didn't try to get out of the car. He just looked at me for a long moment, then drove away. The second car followed. "They're gone," Zip said, still holding the phone. "Lorna's on her way anyway, wants to make sure we're okay." But I understood what had just happened. The Detroit crew had come to assess the situation, to decide whether I was a threat that needed to be eliminated or just a civilian who'd gotten caught up in circumstances beyond his control. They'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Felix Hart was in federal prison, his operation was destroyed, and his assets had been seized. Taking revenge against me wouldn't recover their losses or restore their business relationship. It would just bring more law enforcement attention to their activities. From their perspective, I was a problem that had already solved itself. When Lorna arrived 20 minutes later, I explained what had happened. She took notes, promised to increase patrols in the area, and asked the question I'd been expecting for months. "Was it worth it, Aaron? Destroying your marriage, putting yourself in danger, turning your life upside down for revenge?" I looked around my shop. The tools I'd inherited from my father, the equipment I'd bought with 15 years of honest work, the business I'd built from nothing into something sustainable and profitable. All of it still mine, still intact, still representing the life I'd chosen to build. "Ask me again in a year," I said. 6 months after Naomi's sentencing, I received a letter from her. It was postmarked from the minimum security facility where she was serving her sentence, written on standard prison stationery and handwriting I recognized, but that looked somehow different, smaller, more careful, like she was rationing words. "Aaron," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to say some things before the divorce is final." I read the letter in my workshop, sitting in the same chair where I'd planned my campaign against Felix Hart. "I know what I did was wrong. Not just the affair, but everything else. The lies, the money, the way I put our marriage at risk for something that was never real. Felix made me believe I was special, that I deserved more than what we had. I see now that what we had was real, and I threw it away for something that was just manipulation and greed." She wrote about prison, about the other women serving time for similar mistakes, about the classes she was taking, and the therapy sessions that were helping her understand how she'd justified her actions. "I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to, but I want you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not just our marriage, but the respect of someone I should have treasured instead of betraying." The letter ended with an apology and a request that I not visit or write back. She was trying to accept responsibility for her choices and move forward without dragging me into her process of rehabilitation. I read the letter twice, then put it in a file with the rest of our divorce paperwork. Some part of me felt sorry for the woman who'd written it. She sounded genuinely remorseful, and prison was undoubtedly teaching her lessons about consequences and choices. But too much had happened for me to feel anything stronger than distant sympathy. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. I kept the shop and most of our assets. Naomi kept her teacher's pension and the small inheritance she'd received from her grandmother years earlier. We'd agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. But after paying lawyers and settling the debts she'd accumulated during her involvement with Felix, there wasn't much left to divide. I moved into a small apartment above the shop, a space I'd use for storage but could easily convert to living quarters. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and it reminded me every day that I'd survived something that could have destroyed everything I'd worked for. Business was good. Word had gotten around about my role in bringing down Felix Hart's organization. Not the details, but enough to establish my reputation as someone who didn't back down from dangerous situations. I got calls from customers who wanted security modifications for their vehicles, custom work that paid well, and challenged my skills in new ways. More importantly, I hired 2 additional employees. Not because I needed them for the work, but because I wanted to create something bigger than just a one-man operation. Something that could outlast me and provide good jobs for people like Zip, who understood the value of building things with their hands. Zip was promoted to shop foreman with a raise and profit sharing that reflected his loyalty during the difficult months. He never asked for details about what had happened between me and Naomi, but he'd proven himself trustworthy when it mattered most.